You know what I hate?
These days have
I
done their
hate
homework.
penalties.
Perfect penalty.
Okay, let me be a little bit more specific. I don't mind seeing a penalty called for a blatant foul in the penalty box. In this case, the penalty is just fine. Now, the part that I hate is everybody lining up to take penalty shots at the end to decide a close match. It's just such an unsatisfying way to finish the match. And you know what's the worst part about all of this? The worst part is that I can't really think of a viable replacement for this system. I don't like the system, but I mean, what are you going to do? If you have like a World Cup match, you're not going to make the guys go out there and like run until their legs fall off or anything like that, right? We're kind of stuck with the penalty shootout whether we like it or not. Well, the penalty shootout hasn't always been a part of the sport, of course. There have been cup matches in the past that were settled in the end by a replay. So in the case of this famous German Cup semifinal in 1984, Bayern München and Schalke 04 simply couldn't be separated. This legendary match was perfect in large part because it was a draw. It wasn't settled by some stupid 12-yard lottery. It wasn't until this goal in the replay a week later that the outcome was finally settled after a whopping 210 minutes of football. Well, the thing is that replays aren't great for the players, of course. I mean, you don't want all of that fixture congestion. And it gives the managers a nightmare. I mean, imagine having to face that in Football Manager. But that's actually part of the fun of this, right? And it only seems fitting that both teams would get a chance to actually play another full match to determine the winner. So you don't want any of this golden goal nonsense or people getting lucky with penalties or whatever. That's the way that it was in the FA Cup for well over a century. And so when this goal was controversially waved off for offside and Leeds United and Arsenal remained scoreless after their fourth round draw in late January 1991, the teams had to meet again a few days later for a replay. And by the way, he was clearly onside, it's not even close.
Was he off or not? I'd like to know your view on that, Trevor Brooking.
Anyway, the replay was also a draw, which meant a second replay on February 13th. The second replay was also a scoreless draw, which meant a third replay. Okay, I have to admit, after going over that, the old system really was kind of crazy. I mean, for example, that third replay was scheduled for February 16th, which is the same day that the next round of the FA Cup started. So you have, the team that faced the winner of this has to sit around and wait for them to finally figure out who's going to win. And I mean, what happens if that third round of replays is then still a draw? You have to play it again. It's kind of crazy. I mean, you do wonder why it took 360 minutes of football here to finally determine a winner. Before all of this took place, of course, the Football Association had decided to start using the penalty shootout after a single replay in the later rounds of the FA Cup. It started the next year. Apparently, there were law enforcement reasons for this decision, which doesn't make sense to me, but whatever, that's what they said. Anyway, this decision went against tradition and history, and it was very controversial. And in the case of Arsenal versus Leeds United, of course, it really did seem unfair. After all, these two teams had been tied for all but 90 seconds of the first three matches. And I think that this is a perfect example of what the problem really is with the penalty shootout. I mean, so you've got a match that's like a total epic matchup. It's really hard for one team to get ahead. It's really tight and it's drawn for most of the time. And then you decide in the end that you're going to resolve it through the most random procedure possible. It just doesn't feel right. And the thing is, it's never really felt right. Well, despite being on the road, Arsenal went ahead early in the third replay. And then Arsenal went up another goal before halftime. Now, Leeds were able to get one back in the second half to at least make it close. But they were never quite able to get close enough to equalize, and Arsenal won 2-1. And, while I do understand that the penalty shootout will bring you at least some temporary excitement, it just doesn't feel all that satisfying in the end. In fact, the penalty itself really has this kind of cheap feeling to it. It's almost like a goal was gifted to the team that got to take the penalty. Now, of course, it wasn't always that way. Well, back in the real old days, there were no penalties. There were only indirect free kicks for fouls. This 1890 Scottish Cup match featured a notorious handball on the goal line, which stirred up cries for a more suitable punishment than just an indirect free kick for such blatant behavior. The penalty first appeared in June 1891 after the International Football Association Board decided to make the change. So the way that penalties were, first of all, is really, really interesting. So for example, you could take it from any point on the 12-yard line that you wanted, and the goalkeeper could advance, and you could actually dribble the ball before you took the shot. It was a lot different back in those days. Well, the modern penalty area didn't come around until 1902, which is also when the penalty spot was first introduced. This was another major rule change that required the cooperation of representatives of all sorts of leagues. And there were still really no rules on where you could position your players. There were only these suggestions. So by the time you get to around the 1920s, the penalty is more or less the same as it is today. They decided in 1923 they were going to regulate where the other players could be when the penalty was taken, for example, because there were a lot of defenders that would line up right on the edge of the penalty area to try to intimidate the penalty taker. But the other interesting thing about the 1920s is that before 1923, they would have certain charity matches in certain places, matches they couldn't use a replay for, and they used an alternative tie-breaking solution for those matches, such as comparing the number of corner kicks that each team had. And so, for example, this Old Firm charity match in 1923 featured a lot of counting corners, even though in the end Rangers won the old-fashioned way with a late goal. And it must have felt bizarre for people to focus so much on winning a random aspect of the game like corners. Even the cartoonists poked fun at the idea. The idea grew to the point where the English Football Association started asking around about it. In the end, though, the FA expressly banned that practice. Anyway, so they got rid of using corner kicks to figure out who should win the match. It's sort of similar, by the way, to American football, though this was decades earlier in like the 1880s. They used to use the number of safeties to determine which team won if the score was tied. It's just bizarre stuff for us today. Anyway, they got rid of that idea, but you still had matches that would end up as a tie. It couldn't be a tie if you had to declare a winner, and so they would use alternative means. Eventually, they got to the point where they had the penalty shootout, but it used to be a lot worse. So, for example, there was this scoreless draw between Italy and the Soviet Union for the semi-final of Euro 1968. It was close at the end, but neither side managed to score a single goal. And so, at the end of a breathtaking but scoreless match, they decided to resolve it by flipping a coin. And so Italy won. Now, if you ask me, this is like the ultimate buzzkill, right? I mean, this is worse than the shootout, because if you're in the stadium and it's settled by a coin flip, you didn't even get to see what happened, right? I mean, like the clip that I just showed you, there's actually no coin flip as part of it. People are just sort of standing around. I'm guessing they went back to the back room to have the stupid coin flip. And I mean, seriously, what kind of logic is that? You're going to settle a football match by flipping a coin? Of course, it's not like the penalty shootout is really much better than that.
He's pulled off a fine save.
I still find the 12-yard lottery absolutely boring.
Perfect penalty.
But maybe it's just me, or maybe it's the way the Football Manager presents things, I don't know.
Have done their homework. Saved it.
But what I do know, though, is that there was once upon a time a much more interesting method of conducting the shootout than what we have today. And I'm really having a hard time understanding why this didn't catch on. Okay, so as you guys probably know by now, the North American Soccer League took its own unique approach to the sport. The crowds at most NASL matches weren't all that great, and so the league decided to try a few experiments. Out of concern about matches that ended in a draw, the NASL adopted a penalty shootout at the end of every single regular season match starting in 1974. And after that system proved unpopular, they changed the rules to something that looked a little bit more like a hockey penalty shot. Well, I can't really explain to you this old NASL system of the penalty shootout. It's the sort of thing that you really have to see to be able to understand or even to believe. And when you really think about it, it's a really creative addition. It added a ton of challenge here to the shootout, even though when you look at it in retrospect, it might look a little bit strange. You'd get the ball 35 yards out and you had 5 seconds to advance it and to try to score a goal. The taker could do basically whatever he wanted in those 5 seconds, and the keeper could move off his line to make a stop as needed. Part of the problem, though, was the 5-second rule, which led to all sorts of arguments about whether the player took too much time. For example, this penalty clearly took more than 5 seconds and was ruled out as a result. Only a few minutes later, in the same match, this penalty was ruled okay, even though it also clearly took more than 5 seconds.
Let's watch it now.
It's over. They're allowing the goal.
One of the lasting images of the NASL was the number of arguments caused by this horrible officiating.
The owner of this thing leaves a little bit heated at this point. Unbelievable.
Now, I might be biased. As you know, I do a lot of videos on the NASL. I'm pretty fascinated with the league, even though it ended before I was born. But I do think that this old NASL model actually worked pretty well despite all of the controversies and all the problems. And in fact, if they were to bring something like this back today, I think it would actually work pretty well because we're, I guess, a little bit better at counting down 5 seconds these days than they were in the late 1970s. But at least we still have the unforgettable image of Pelé trying to take one of these.
Sprinter on his line there. In fact, he's off his line before the whistle. And away we go. Here comes Pelé. The shot. Cooper.
You've got to admit, though, that these penalty shots at least look better than what we have today. And the nice thing about these penalty shots is that the players actually had to, think strategically before taking them.
Banks falls down, and it's in there. That's it. And the Cosmos have won.
And I would argue that the tension the old NASL method of penalties created was much greater and more interesting than anything that we see today.
Here's the shot. Missed it. Wide left. We're still scoreless.
Unfortunately, though, that system largely died off with the NASL, as well as with some of the other weird ideas that they had, like that 35-yard offside line on both sides of the field, and like the weird way they had of counting up points according to the numbers of goals scored and stuff. The truth is that the NASL was taking a lot of this stuff from hockey at various levels, right? So the 35-yard line was supposed to be the equivalent of hockey's blue lines, right? And the penalty system was basically the hockey shootout system. That's exactly where they got it from. Anyway, when it started out, Major League Soccer used this penalty system for about 2 years in the mid-90s. Then the sport abandoned it and decided to do what FIFA told it to do, and we haven't heard of this penalty system since. Now, if you ask me, though, these days, I really think we would be better off experimenting with this system. It's a lot more fun to watch, it's a lot more interesting, and it provides a lot more variety. Unfortunately, though, as you know, I'm not in charge of anything. I'm barely in charge of anything in my own life. And so it ends up that we'll end up with this boring system for the indefinite future.